got the story, Mr. Kwa. We have a bit more time than anticipated. So, Professor Mooney and Professor Tan, do you want to take 5 minutes to address what's said first?
No, we just hear some of
Okay. What I do is I open the floor for question and answer. I'll take about 3 or 4 questions at one go so that the speakers can address them as quickly as they can. Please introduce yourself, keep your comment and your question really brief. If you have a specific question for a specific panel member, then please state so. So can we start with the first question? Yes, Pallavi.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering if the panel could talk a bit more on what role does the bilateral relationship between India and Pakistan play in the making of India-Chinese relations, and what difference does the changing India-Pakistan relationship make on their relations with China?
Thank you. Next question.
Okay, my name is Tang Li. As everyone knows, I run a blog. My comment is more to Professor Rajesh Basrur, is that you made a point that China is going through a state of domestic and political stress, in the sense that you have a communist government with a very capitalistic economy, and how do the two meet? And okay, what I've, talking to a few people, the answer is China gets along right now because the people running China, who may be communists, are very pragmatic. But how does everything change if you get a situation where China has a political upheaval and the system of government has to be more responsive to nationalistic feelings on the ground?
Third question, Surya.
Yeah. There was this mention of hierarchy of interests for China with reference to the US. And Professor Mohan also spoke of the possibility of a US card for India. In terms of hierarchy of interests, how would you position these 3 countries? That's the question.
And one last question for this first set. Yes?
My name is Aparna Raman. I just want to ask that as India's foreign policy may be slightly more tilted towards the US right now. But really, for the average citizen of India, it is more of an envious approach towards China. It's like the doctor in the class. The progress and the prosperity of China have inspired a lot of Indians like me, middle class Indians. And we wonder why the Indian state cannot take a leaf or learn out of China rather than indulging in some sort of competition. Why not co-opt China and learn from them? Because frankly, as an Indian, I'm more inspired by China than I'm inspired by India itself, or the leaders at the moment.
Thanks. So the first round, maybe we will start with Mr. Chan. Rajesh? Yes,
I think the Pallavi's question on, I think there has been a triangle in terms of what happens between India, Pakistan and China, going right back to the 49-50 period itself, where you see the Chinese reaching out to Pakistan, even when the relationship with India was very good. You see in Bandung, where actually the Chinese and the Pakistanis make the first contact, and it sets the stage for the transformation of the relationship. I think the classical view is that, look, I mean, China wants to balance India, therefore Pakistan will always be an instrument. So therefore, what China has done for Pakistan, giving nuclear technology, missile technology, so it is a classical way of limiting India's freedom by supporting Pakistan. Now, in India, there's always been a big debate. Do we cut a deal with Pakistan so that our space will improve, or do you try to change the dynamic with Pakistan, with China? I think we've tried both. I mean, in both directions. I mean, the success is still elusive. But the general argument would be, look, China is a state. At least you can deal with a coherent state, and without any of the burden of partition, etc. That actually someday maybe you can do a deal with China. Pakistan has become far more complicated. It's linked deeply to India's own partition, so therefore it's far more messier. But I think whichever direction India moves, it carves itself out more space, because it frees India to do more things both within the region and globally. So any normalization, any improvement with Pakistan and China, or only one of them, it gives India more room to play, and that's why consistently we had last 3 governments of different political persuasions have sought to change the relationship with both China and Pakistan. On domestic upheaval, I mean, I have a problem that you can't make any policy on the basis China will weaken because of domestic. And the Chinese look at India and say, look, lucky to be China when you look at India's weaknesses. I mean, the legion. So I don't think China's internal weaknesses automatically make it easier for India to deal with the problem. Lucky if you get a bonus. But you can't run a foreign policy on the expectation that something terrible will happen in China. Therefore, both of us, I think, are deeply vulnerable domestic. And you would say India has more vulnerabilities. Or some would say, look, China has more vulnerabilities. But I think that's a condition that affects both. On the hierarchy, look, I think US is number one, China is number two, India is. So I think India is in a kind of position where China was when Deng Xiaoping took charge. The US-China, US-Russia rivalry, the Second Cold War. Deng Xiaoping brilliantly leveraged it for China's transformation by getting Western support and simultaneously normalizing relationship with the Soviet Union. So if anything, India can learn from China, and as I said, certainly on foreign policy, how Deng Xiaoping actually used a very opportune moment to transform China itself. But India, there's far more nervousness of playing this game, but I think the template still exists. One, I think China is already an example. Like throughout our reform period, that the exhortation for domestic audiences was, look, Communist China is doing this, why is the stupid Indian Communist Party of India Marxist? Doesn't understand. So you always pointing to, look, China is doing this, China has lowered barriers, so therefore we must do it. China is liberalizing foreign direct investment, therefore we must do it. So China is already the benchmark. So there is a China benchmark in the domestic discourse on how we think about ourselves for the future. But clearly, I mean, a whole new generation, I think the nature of an explosive, dramatic expansion of contact between China and India just begun. I mean, Chinese are issuing visas for 500,000, it's 500,000. India is much less. So there is going to be these two economies more they connect. It's going to be a dramatic explosion, expansion of the relationship. And still, I mean, China is number 2 economy, India will get, it's already number 10, hopefully we'll get number 5 in the next 5 years. It is inevitable. But the problem, there are other problems. But as neighbors, nobody likes their neighbors. China is sitting on our territory. You ask the Chinese say, look, they're sitting, giving refuge to Dalai Lama. And imagine if China had a government in exile of Kashmir. But that's what we're doing. And of course, we tell the Chinese with a straight face, Dalai Lama is a spiritual figure. Maybe he is. But so there is a problem of territoriality, which you can't take away. But meanwhile, there's expansion of economic cooperation, there's expansion of a whole range of things. So things are beginning to happen for the first time since our independence. In the 50s, it was mere talk, bye-bye, there was nothing, there was no economic contact. But today, there is substance to that relationship, and that's what makes it very, very different.
I think Raja has said pretty much all there is to be said, but just a couple of minor points. And one is that, you know, to understand the politics of what we can call Southern Asia, we have to recognize that there is always, as he said, domestic politics at play. And the fact is that domestic politics being at play means that it's very hard to compromise and negotiate a solution beyond a point to the disputes between India and Pakistan and between India and China. All three governments are relatively weak. I said it's again a hierarchy of weakness, maybe, you know, that Pakistan seems to be worse off today. But the fact is that no Indian government, which is a coalition government, is going to be able to compromise on the border very easily. And for that matter, it's not that different in China. You know, it's not a question of, you know, monolithic party rule. It's that I think the Chinese themselves have said again and again, usually obliquely, that they are internally vulnerable, that they are in a state of transition and they are struggling to deal with it. And the one legitimizing factor is nationalism in all three countries. And because of that, we are not going to see any solution. At the same time, you know, we have this problem of security, whatever you call it, domestic politics. On the other side, we have a rising trend of economic cooperation. And that's going to be happening between India and Pakistan as well, and we can see it coming. The point is that the two will coexist, as they have between so many countries, between Japan and China, between the US and China. So the game is hedging. And in a hedging game, making some kind of grand strategy is very, very difficult. I think they just play it ad hoc and see what happens. Try to keep the relationship within a band, so to speak, where it doesn't go into too much of conflict, and the possibility of much more collaboration and cooperation is also constrained.
Well, I think you are the best qualified to answer your own question on India-Pakistan relations with China. But I think here, how you answer the question, how you would define the question depends very much on your views. So if you are like Mohan, a hard realist, a structural realist, then you hear what the views are. But if you take a more liberal institutionalist perspective, you get entirely different. I suspect you are going more on the constructivist view of international relations, where it becomes an issue of how Pakistan is constructing its identity over the years. In the 50s, under the military rule, the Khan was one. Then when General Zia comes in 1972, there's a complete change of Pakistan's identity and the way it thinks of itself as a Muslim nation. And then post 9/11, it's completely different again. So I think our Indian friends will have to live with Pakistan's struggles to define who and what it is in the world today.
I think when Deng Xiaoping changed China, he had an incredible advantage of a horrible nightmare that China lived through prior to that, which is of course the Cultural Revolution. And with that card in hand, he could institute a lot of the change. And if you are to believe Farid Zakaria's piece about the depoliticization of the Chinese political system, which he wrote during the time when Po Xilai was arrested, that what Deng did was actually to reduce the political side of things and made the leadership much more technocratic. So the issue was solving economic problems, bringing economic growth to the individual cities or whatever it was, until we come to what we see today, where cities fight with each other for investment. Everybody wants to have a financial center. I mean, it's in the middle of nowhere, it wants a financial center. But that's how it is. But Deng did that because everyone was a civil servant or a party member. You got your promotion in the party and you were assigned, you were not elected. The domestic issues and the state politics or even the municipal politics in India are extremely complicated. But China has a whole different set of municipal and provincial problems. Not so much about elective politics, but how do you actually deliver these goods in this day and age, which I think the leadership is finding it more and more difficult. And it is because of that a lot of Chinese business people, they're running scared. I mean, if you meet up with many of them, why have they moved out so much money out of China? Why have they gone and tried to buy land, tried to buy houses, tried to buy huge tracts of forest? Now, some people believe they're acting for the Chinese government. It may well be. But many of them are certainly wealthy enough to buy some of these things. I'm sitting at a conversation. This man was seriously talking because he is a great environmentalist. He has plenty of money. His company on NASDAQ is worth about $2 billion. He himself is worth several $1 billion. And he's talking about buying 50,000 square kilometers of Brazilian jungle. So So what do you want with the jungle? You know, I said, never mind, I mean, jungles will grow, I don't have to tend it, and wood is always important. And we just keep it, and it's environmentally very good. Because he's a very staunch Buddhist, he doesn't want to rear animals, because then you slaughter the animals and things like that. So he's buying 50,000 square kilometers of jungle. Now, why is all this money going out? Partly, I suspect, now that they have money, they're a little bit scared. What if the mood suddenly changed in China? Individual tycoons have been arrested, and then they disappear for a while. Their companies are very badly affected, and nobody wants that to happen to them individually. But whether, and this comes to this gentleman's question about whether there's going to be some domestic sort of splits in China. I'm not sure the picture will come out as, well, here's one faction fighting another faction. They will patch it over for as long as they can, even in something that was so challenging for them when they went after Po Xilai. Because Po Xilai was probably the most political of all the leaders, and understanding the politics of China, played up the old Maoist policies, which you cannot attack him for. What's wrong with that? You know, this is like motherhood. And yet now the only way you can go after a leader like Po Xilai is to link him to the murder of this Englishman and other corruption charges. It's nothing to do with politics. But it was a political struggle, obviously, between different factions within China. And those things can manifest itself in terms of some of the economic policies that the country will have to develop. But as of now, at least, I think China has been able to keep that solidarity, that front, in which they will develop some of their foreign policies to see how you're going to take this newfound wealth, their newfound position in the world. The thing that haunts China till today is still the Opium War and the insult that they feel that they have been they had to pay for during all those years. And if you look at the relationship with Japan, the Japan that China looks at, this is visceral. They can accept almost anything, but with Japan, it's just very, very bad because it's a very deep, almost cultural difference. And if you go to the city of Nanjing, it's very interesting that all over China you will find Japanese restaurants. Very popular, everybody loves it, they go to eat Japanese food. But you will never find a Japanese restaurant on the streets of Nanjing. You can find it in the hotels, but not on the street. Because every time a Japanese restaurant opens, its windows get broken, you know, people will smear things on it. Because it's so deep in their entire emotions, it's so high. So they drive down this way, and as they see it, America is their real competitor. That's who they measure themselves against. Japan is someone they have to deal with, a very powerful economy, but it's very easy to light a fuse under the Chinese when it comes to the Japanese. And I think when it comes to India, it is there, but it's not really high on the radar screen, which is, maybe it's to the advantage of South Asia, because you are now becoming much more knowledgeable about China than maybe they are of South Asia, and they should be, for all the reasons that have been said today. And it's quite sad that they don't venture out as much. You take a look at the investments in Bangladesh on garment manufacturing. There are Taiwanese there, there are Koreans there, there are not that many PRC companies there, much less than one would have expected, since most of these garments were once manufactured in China. And yet people are pulling out of China, but when they go out, it is not, they don't go to South Asia.
Mr. Chan. Next round, Mr. Ali first.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you. Thank you. We listened with great interest this story about the rising China, emerging India, and South Asia. But I think we cannot have a full discussion without making reference to something about Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia lies between India and China. And I think it's inevitable, as has happened historically, that rivalry growth of India and China will have an impact on Southeast Asia. So I was wondering if your panelists could venture their opinions on the role of Southeast Asia in the rivalry in the coming years, whether there could be a division of spheres of influence between India and China in Southeast Asia. For example, the lineup of India with Indonesia and Vietnam against China with other countries in the region. And therefore, there will be a whole new dimension to this strategic engagement of China and India with Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Mr. Ali. Professor Muni? Let me get a couple more. Any other questions? Yes. Behind you.
Manaswini Ramkumar from IDSS. My question is to Professor Basrur and to Professor Rajamohan. Professor Basrur, your presentation was on perceptions and influence. And I wanted to ask, what is the role of the media between India and China in creating perception and influence? India's overly free liberal media that's fear-mongering about China amongst Indian citizens, and China's publicly controlled media that's at the least dismissive or disingenuous towards India, or at the very worst hawkish towards India. So how does the media creating perceptions among the population affect policy making between these two countries vis-a-vis both of them?
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. My name is Mo Jikang. I'm a visiting fellow in RSIS. I have two questions. The first one is about water issues. Does Indian government really perceive China's behavior in the Yalozam River as a threat? You know, as I know that India has its own satellites to watch closely on China's behaviors on river. So I think India knows exactly what China is doing. This is the first question. The second question is about Afghanistan issues. India has a lot of interests in Afghanistan, and many Indian experts said that India has very few strategic resources to influence or to protect India's interests in this area. So India needs more cooperation with other countries to deal with this issue. So my question is, which country is India now cooperating or will cooperate most closely? In United States or China or SCO?
One last question for this.
I don't have a question. I have a chapter in the book, but can I make a comment on the way Chinese conduct their diplomacy? And I think all of us should be aware of this. I've been in the government of my country, Bangladesh, for 2 years, but I've lived in China for about 40 years. First as a Pakistani civil servant, and thereafter as a Bangladeshi diplomatic civil servant. You see, in the late 60s, when Pakistan first began its relations with China, we did a piece on Qian Long's trip to South in 1797, I think it was. The point that was made by the Pakistani minister was that it's an invitation to learn from the South, bringing China, Pakistan close together. 71, when China opposed the division of Pakistan, but not necessarily, I mean, this is the subtlety of Chinese diplomacy. Not the creation of Bangladesh, but the division of Pakistan. And China argued that what they were opposing was not the, as I said, emergence of Bangladesh, but singing in a duet of Soviet social imperialism and Indian expansions. And once that was accepted by our side, they raised Bangladesh to the level of an all-weather friend. So that's That's how they conduct their diplomacy, and there's something to learn from that.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chaudhary. I'll get Professor Muni to respond to the questions. Sorry, I missed his hand earlier.
His hand shaking.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair, for the time. First, to some of the panelists, some of the questions raised by panelists. I think there are a number of areas have been identified by Raja Mohan, Professor Basrur, Kwa Chong, as to why they were not included in the book. What we did was to give a brief to all the contributors and left it to them. And as you know, the contributors are mostly from the countries where they are writing their perceptions. So it would have been very uncalled for on our part to say that you deal with this issue or you don't deal with this issue. That's why, you know, the question of either water or balance of power or India's border issue, we didn't want to force the contributors to. And therefore it is, in a way, narrowly state-centric bilateral perception. That's why the US doesn't figure into it in a prominent way. Even India doesn't figure into it in a prominent way. When some of these contributors were relating themselves to China, they did not refer that we are doing it because of India or whatever else it is. I think this is just an explanation to say why areas were left out or were not left out. The second question of the equation between India, Pakistan and China. We must understand that whatever China does in Pakistan is not, and I underline not, entirely for India or because of India. There is a body of independent bilateral relations between the two countries. The Chinese role in Gwadar, which has been a major point of discussion in the media, is not simply to go and sit down for India or to have on the other side. It may be, this may be also one of the implications of it. But Gwadar, they started, China has its own defense requirements. And I mentioned it, that China needs South Asian countries. And China needs Pakistan greatly for the Islamic factor, for access to Indian Ocean. Hajj people, before access through Karachi, used to go via Shanghai. Imagine a person going to Hajj via Shanghai from Xinjiang would be spending how much of money unless it wants to take the other route. Therefore, Pakistan route became a very useful route. So this is just one caveat we must, that there is a body of relationship which is independent of India. So far as India is concerned, that many of this, I think some dimensions of this relationship, if the Chinese or the Pakistanis can use it against India, will use it against India. There is absolutely no denying the fact. But a lot of the Chinese support to Pakistan has not gone to the extent what Pakistan expected. And look at the two wars of 65 and 71, very critical. When Pakistan expected a lot, what the Chinese would do, and Chinese did not come up to, Pakistanis may not admit it in public, is a different story. Therefore, there are limits to what China would do to Pakistan in any India-Pakistani problem. We must understand that also very, very well. So when you look at this equation, and third aspect of it, that lot of support from China to Pakistan was also to make sure that Pakistan does not become a launching pad for the US policies, for which it was originally meant as an ally. And up to 60s it continued. But a lot more, and most of the Chinese support have started coming to Pakistan after 64, 65 in a major way. And not in diplomatic and other terms. And this was largely to make sure that Pakistan was not made use of by the US. Imagine a situation from the Chinese perspective that if both India and Pakistan were to cooperate with the US
on anything against China, China would be in a terrible mess. Therefore, it is a kind of an equation in which there are other variables and factors we should keep it in mind. The second equation is about India, US and China. And my contention, which Raja said, I mean, the point made is absolutely valid, that one will have to look into the parameters of this equation. But at the present, and I think for another 10 or if not 20, if not 30, at least 10 to 15 years to come, a major problem is how China-US equation is shaping up. And why should India put its cards on the table at this stage? I see absolutely no reason for anyone. And there is a debate. We should stand by the US, we should not stand by China, we should stand by China, we should not stand by US. I think this is from India's national interest point of view, the two are engaged with each other. We don't know what kind of an equation they will shape up between themselves. Let us wait and watch and take as much advantage, as Raja said very rightly, out of this relationship. I think that's what the Indian policy seems to be, to my mind, at this stage, and that's what the equation is. In fact, the other day, Kwa raised the question of who is Vishnu. I would say the real problem in Indo-Pacific, the Samudra Manthan. The Samudra Manthan is between China and the US. India is the Vishnu, if I put it to you this way. And we will take advantage of this Samudra Manthan as far as we can. When we get into a corner, we will see how to respond, how not to respond, and try. This is just one perspective to look into it. Now, Tibet, we are not neglecting at all. I mean, you have seen the police patrols protecting the Chinese delegation. You do not know that the Tibetan protesters are from Delhi itself. They live huge. I mean, I am not disclosing any secrets, but as a student of India's foreign policy, I mean, there is an encouragement to the Tibet, and also there is an assurance to the Chinese that we will not let you humiliated in Delhi. What's wrong with that? And therefore, there is no way. I can give you several examples of how India is not neglecting Tibet at all. And in fact, there is a new resurgence among the Indian strategic community to say that now that peaceful coexistence phase is over, the agreement is over, why should we not open up the Tibetan issue internationally? There is a body of analysts and influential people who want to work it that way. So it's not a question. Now, Raja said radiating Chinese influence in South Asia. Correct, in terms of one proposition that the Chinese influence and capacity to play a greater role in South Asia has tremendously been enhanced. But, and there were questions related to that, but there are severe limits to what extent China can use South Asian countries to harm India, excepting Pakistan. There are absolutely severe limitations. You take specific examples, we can go into it. I mean, no matter the distances are being covered, the infrastructure is being raised, but you can never get the kind of civilizational touch which you have amongst the South Asian countries and between South Asian countries and China. I mean, who will travel on this infrastructure? You can lay down there is a serious question in Nepal, for instance, that if you lay down the rail network and connect it to Tibet, how many people would be using it? There are real limitations on what can be the depth of the engagement, no matter you can create infrastructure for that. I think I'll on subtlety of Chinese diplomacy. You have not seen the other side of the Chinese diplomacy. Please ask the East Asian countries and South China Sea countries. Ask Vietnam. Ask Myanmar, for instance. Ask Philippines, for instance. There are different dimensions of any country's diplomacy. I know there is a lot of discomfort in South Asia in dealing with India because I said we interact with each other almost on every point. We live in each other's intestines. We cannot help but affect each other. Therefore, it worries us most each other. Chinese are distant. There are pleasantries and one can do with them. Thank you.
It was a movie, we got a few minutes to Rajesh and Raja to quickly address a few questions that were asked by Mr. Kwa as well.
Well, just a couple of things, and one is a question directly addressed to me about public opinion. I think it's fairly accepted now that public opinion matters, whether you are liberal democracy or you're something else. I mean, it was way back in 1852 that Louis Napoleon Bonaparte overthrew his own government and then declared himself emperor by the will of God and the will of the people. So ever since then, I think we have something like a mass society, which political sociologists talk about, and no government will neglect the power of public opinion as a base for their, legitimacy. And therefore, I think the Chinese and the Indians will use it in different ways. It's true the Chinese may use it differently from that in India, but don't think that in India it is a free press which is raising this. A lot of it comes out of arms of the government as well. So, I mean, it's a moot point who is using who.
Southeast Asia is going to be important. I think the links between South Asia and Southeast Asia itself only being rediscovered now. It's not too far away that Pakistan was part of something called Seattle, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Pakistan was very much part of it. But people say, look, I mean, what has South Asia got to do with us? There was interesting things that happened in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. And before that, it was undivided India's armies that actually pushed the Japanese out of Southeast Asia. So I think as China rises and India begins to emerge, there is going to be interpenetration of these regions, because by the sheer logic of the Chinese economic power, there is going to be greater integration. There is going to be breakdown of the previous conception of separate theaters. And I think in that, Southeast Asia will have a crucial role in what it does. Media, look, most of the problems are with Indian media. Let's be clear that it's become just a chaos with nobody in charge. So you have actually a complete disregard for facts. Somebody talked about Brahmaputra. Look, 80% of the catchment of the Brahmaputra waters takes place on the Indian side of the border. But Chinese are insensitive in a sense. Look, it doesn't take much to consult India saying, look, given what they're facing in Mekong, to call the Indian side and South Asians and say, look, we're doing some of this stuff. This is not going to affect you. But Chinese don't think it is necessary. And Indians, of course, don't put all the facts in together. So it becomes one more thing to say, oh my God, Chinese are up to one more trick. So there is a problem. I think hopefully someone who writes for me, that it is a terrible situation, and hopefully we'll be able to modify this as both sides begin to engage each other. On the Afghanistan question, look, India will cooperate with anyone who would stop the extremists from coming. That's the basic bottom line. At this point, we're not clear what the Americans are up to. They might hand over parts of Afghanistan to Pakistanis, we don't know. We don't know the all-weather relationship between Pakistan and China. Will actually lead to Pakistan, Chinese coming into Afghanistan with the help of the ISI and the Pakistan army. We're not going to like that. Last time Taliban was there, we cooperated with Iran, with Russia, with the Central Asian republics to defeat the Taliban. So it depends on, it's a very flexible place. Your friends and enemies depend on the circumstance, and a lot would depend on what would happen in Afghanistan in the next years. The last point, I think on the connectivity, I think, which Kwa was making this point earlier, I think the point I was making was that, look, that there was no physical connectivity across the Himalayas for centuries, post-Buddhism. I think whether any number of people who travel on these roads or not, you see the beginnings of the connection that's being established between Western China and South Asia. So it's not just the Karakoram Highway. The Chinese have set up a dry port in parts of Kashmir are occupied by the Pakistani Chinese. So what you have is actually the integration of the Chinese economy, which has taken place far more vigorously in Southeast Asia, where the trans-border influence of the Chinese economy begins to be felt. Some of that we're going to see in the subcontinent. Ultimately, I would say, look, India should be prepared to say, look, if a train line comes to Nepal border, I think we should say, look, we'll take our train line and meet them somewhere halfway, because then you have traffic to go up and down. Because I think it is still India's security wallahs unable to see, look, there's no train line which only goes one way. So if there is connection between Western China and South Asia, South Asia has more population. Chinese places are more empty. In fact, the Chinese will be more worried about opening up the borders. But for India, I think over longer term, opening up the land frontiers with China will be a strategic advance which will transform over the longer term the nature of the relationship between China and South Asia.
If I may make one final plea or question. In the 1920s and 30s, in the last 2 decades of his life, Tagore made a passionate plea for a new Asia, a new pan-Asianism, in fact the Asian Renaissance, preempting what in Singapore we were going to preach in the 1990s. Is that dream of Tagore's completely gone now today? There's no place for it in this new geopolitics?
I think it's gone actually. There's more integration. Many of the ideas of the 1920s are actually being realized today, at least on the economic front. But it is the political divisions that we got to manage.
You go first.
If I may, I'll address the question on the media. I think the presence of the social media has become such a leveler in all societies that despite the fact that there is the official media and a very powerful official media in China, people read it really as signals of what the government wants to do. People are not even getting the news from it any longer because those are just the official pronouncements. But the social media has become very big, very powerful, and indeed it is influencing the Chinese government. The South China Sea has become one of those issues that what started off as the Chinese wanting to get the citizens interested has driven them into a position where they have to be careful that they are not being led by ultra-nationalist sort of views. And curiously in this whole thing, or maybe not curiously, the least powerful of the ministries in this whole debate is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's really unimportant. Their perceptions and the reports of each other, I don't follow the Indian press as closely, but the Chinese press on India is relatively little. I asked to check what was the reporting on the rape in Delhi inside China. Well, the answer was that there were all the news reports. What was the interest of the netizens? Some not very great. It didn't seem to create as much of an interest than even in Singapore. In Singapore, there was a lot of reaction to it. The official reaction, zero. Nothing to do with us. Maybe much of this happens in China anyway. So what's the big deal? So it does have the understanding between the two large countries, India and China, is actually not very strong. Now, whether the Tagore ideal will come about, I think may come from just the people. The number of Indians now living in China has really been increasingly, quite substantially, even in a period of 6 years that I've lived and visited China regularly. Just the number there. And I guess it's driven by economics, very simple. But the knowledge of it is not high. In Southeast Asia, I don't know if the influence of India is felt as much as the influence of China. In my years in Thailand, I've always found it very interesting that the Indian ambassador told me that she can read all the signs written in Thai because it's Sanskrit, but she doesn't know what it means. It's just like many Chinese who read Japanese, katakana, hiragana, and kanji. You can read the words, but it has a totally different meaning. But as far as the Thais are concerned, they somehow don't recognize that so much of that culture is India-based. They would prefer not to see it that way. And perhaps India has not just done as good a job in this soft power side of things. I think the Chinese influence in Southeast Asia is a little greater because of the diaspora. It's really the diaspora that's bringing in. But there is much, I think, that India, we call it Indo-China because that was supposed to be the meeting point, right? But it isn't. It is not really that meeting point. But I think that in Southeast Asia, the orientation currently is towards China because of the economic imperatives. But in Singapore, at least, I think we've been driven to say, let's focus and take a lot more interest in India. It's been paying off in some way, not as much as China, but because the Chinese economy was growing at the rate that it was going.
Thank you, Mr. Chen.
Last 2 minutes. Well, not much to say. One is about, again, raising a question for debate, Raja, about the connectivity. I have, both in Bhutan and Nepal, there is a very strong resistance to connecting directly with China. And I guess some of them have said the Chinese themselves would be worried if, because of the Tibet situation as it is, and similarly towards Xinjiang vis-a-vis Pakistan, that if there is a free movement, therefore this free engagement is actually a problem not of India, so far as South Asia is concerned, not for other countries, but largely of China. To what extent? Well, it's a question of economic capabilities, whether you can build roads into and connections into that area. So that's a different issue. Secondly, is very briefly on India learning from China. I think Raja said very well that India has learnt in economic area with China as much as it is possible. And I might say it for the young ladies concerned that the Chinese have also tried to learn from India in areas, and I mentioned you one, riot control. After, that's a fact, after Tiananmen Square, they sent a delegation to see how, when huge crowds appear suddenly from somewhere, how to manage them without indulging in violence, because the Chinese forces had known only one thing to fire. So there is a mutual learning between the two Asian giants in a very, very significant way. Lastly, just half a minute to Ambassador Mikhail, that India and China and Southeast Asia, my submission is, and I've been repeatedly saying it wherever I get a chance, that South Asia sometimes is expecting too much from India to match their concerns vis-a-vis China. Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is sometimes expecting too much. India cannot match China either economically or militarily at this stage. It doesn't mean that we don't want to remain engaged in the region, but it means very clearly that for every answer to your troubles or your worries or concerns, India cannot provide the answers and cannot provide them satisfactorily.
On that note, I just want to thank the panelists for a very engaging discussion. I'll just hand the floor over to Rahul.
Thank you everyone for your participation in the discussion. We have come to the end of today's event. We would like to invite everyone to enjoy some light refreshments just outside the seminar room. But we also request those who have completed the evaluation form to drop it in the box just at the registration desk. Thank you all and have a pleasant evening.